Now we'll focus on the actual evidence-based models. In this chapter and in this lecture, we'll talk about 8 of the most common. The models are listed on this slide. And for your project this semester, we decided we would just have one model be used to avoid confusing students with figuring out different models and to just simplify the process for utilization of an evidence-based practice model. So I'll talk about a few of them as we progress throughout this lecture. The first model that we're going to talk about is the ARC model, and I mentioned that this model is the model for utilizing evidence-based practice. The ARC, or Advancing Research and Clinical Practice through Close Collaboration model, was developed by Melnick and Fineau-Overholt, the authors of your textbook, the faculty and creators, I think, of the Helene Fold School of Nursing of Evidence-Based Practice, the resource that we've been utilizing throughout this course. This model guides a system-wide approach to implementing and sustaining evidence-based practice to improve patient outcomes. A key strategy in this model is the development of a critical mass of evidence-based practice mentors who can then assist point-of-care clinicians, so nurses on the floor, in consistent implementation of EBP, and by doing that to strengthen the culture within an organization. So the organizational culture of evidence-based practice we know is central to supporting sustainable, high-quality evidence-based care, and implementation of the ARC model can substantially improve patient outcomes. This was developed out of nurse input as well as control theory and cognitive behavioral theory. And the ARC model contends that when a clinician's belief about the value of evidence-based practice and their ability to implement it are strengthened, there is greater implementation of evidence-based practice. This model discusses barriers and facilitators to the process along with clinicians' beliefs about and actual implementation of evidence-based practice, and it can be readily assessed and identified by an organization using established instruments that have been created to go along with it. And we've done some of those surveys as well. An example of the use of this model was the development of a rapid response team policy that was established throughout an entire hospital system after utilizing it in the intensive care unit. Presentations were then made to educate the direct care clinicians who would use the policy, and then unit-based champions were assigned to reinforce the policy, and the EBP team decided that this ARC model was a really good fit for their organization. They decided to make a recommendation to the Shared Governance Steering Committee that the model be adopted for all disciplines throughout the organization. So when a model works and when everybody in the organization knows how to use it well, it's a great thing. This model is a 6-step process, and it's outlined clearly in the picture there. I just put small pictures on these slides, but you can find better pictures in chapter 14 of your textbook. So the Iowa model of evidence-based practice was instituted in 1987. It was revised and updated several times, most recently in 2018. Identifying, implementing, evaluating, and disseminating information to promote quality care and outcomes are the hallmark of this model. The Iowa model provides guidance for nurses and other clinicians in making decisions about day-to-day practices to improve quality outcomes. The Iowa model is an organized and logical process with feedback loops, and it's widely recognized for its applicability and ease of use by multidisciplinary teams. So in the slide, it talks about where it's intended to be used, who the potential users are, and then how it's a 10-step process. So the model starts, the explanation starts on page 389. The picture of the Iowa model does look a little bit different than the picture I have on the slide. It is on page 390. Essentially, though, the Iowa model starts with triggers. So teams are formed to develop, implement, and evaluate the practice change, and then a team would select, review, critique, and synthesize research evidence. And a practice change is piloted. The model outlines a series of activities with 3 critical decision points. The first decision point is to decide whether the problem is a sufficient priority for possible change. It's to generate the question from either a problem-focused or a new knowledge trigger. And the practice site would ask a question like, what is the clinical concern? What isn't working? What do team members want to learn more about in practice? And so a researcher would write the clinical question using the PICO format. The second step then is to decide whether there is sufficient research base. And so this is to determine the relevance to the organizational priorities by collecting and appraising the evidence. A team might have to determine what actually is that makes this problem a priority. Were there changes in outcomes over time, or was there a critical event that led people to ask this question? And then what resources, both internal and external, are available to team members? Is there a cost? Are there interdisciplinary supports in place too? And then the third decision point is to decide whether change is appropriate for adoption in practice. And so those are the pink diamonds in this model. And so it gives you things you can do for a yes answer and a no answer. No answers in this model usually lead to conducting research. And so it wouldn't be appropriate for all organizations, but certainly for some. Let's see. The Iowa model is easy to follow and simple to read, and that's why we chose it for your project. So the Stetler model of evidence-based practice is shown on page 385. All the steps of the phase are described starting on page 386. The original version of the Stetler model was released in 2001 and then revised to clarify phases and then highlight implementation tools. This is known as the practitioner-oriented model, and it's geared towards advanced practice practitioners. That's why we didn't have you guys use it for your projects. There's 5 phases or steps of the model, and we'll talk about those here. On this slide, it says it's a 6-step process, but it is just 5. Here is a picture of the Stetler model and the steps of it. I actually really like the Stetler model. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's really good at focusing your direction. So if you're newer to using evidence-based practice, it can be a good model. Let's see. It considers both internal and external evidence, and it requires individuals' competence in researching or research utilization and evidence-based practice. So it can also be used to help individuals with critical thinking. Let's see. In 2009, Romp and Keel used the Stetler model to revitalize a preceptor program at a large metropolitan tertiary medical center. So the preceptor program was used for newly hired nurses, and the practice change was intended to decrease staff turnover and improve satisfaction of these newly hired nurses, as well as the preceptors. And so they had an 8-hour course that already existed, and some preceptors either didn't attend or weren't aware of the course. And so the team met to assess the risk, resource, and readiness for the practice change. And then they decided to implement a more comprehensive preceptor course with support from administration and a survey to the actual preceptors by using this model. Their results was an increase in satisfaction from preceptors and newly hired nurses, so all parties involved, and their 12-month nurse turnover rate dropped from 13.9 to 10.1. So these models have all been tested in practice, and I think it's important to know that when they're used well, they really do make a difference in moving an evidence-based practice project forward. It's almost like you can just hand it to administration, a project with a model outline, and say, we know where we're going and this is how we can do it, and it covers all of the bases. So these are those 5 phases of the Stetler model written out again. Okay, this model is the Larrabee model. It's called the Model for Evidence-Based Practice Change, and so but it is called Larrabee's model. So this starts on page 396. The type of model is an evidence-based practice, research utilization, and knowledge transformation process. And we talked about the 3 categories of models, and so that was one of them. This model integrates quality improvement principles. It uses teamwork tools and then evidence-based translation strategies to promote adoption of practice changes. I think this model is really nice and easy to use, and it can be used for teams too. And the steps, I think, are easy to understand, that they're concise. So the Johns Hopkins Nursing Evidence-Based Practice Model was developed in 2007, and it was a template for guiding research. Johns Hopkins has some excellent evidence-based practice information. They are similar to the Fold Institute in that they've created a lot of work and done a lot of research in evidence-based practice. This model has 3 phases, and it's a goal with the model to build a culture of nursing practice based on evidence. So it aims to demystify the process for bedside nurses and embed evidence-based practice into the fabric of nursing care. So you'll see the continuous loop of learning and practice in the practice question, evidence, and translation. It starts with a practice question, then gaining evidence, translating the evidence, and moving that to best practice. And then the practice improvements should always be reassessed for continued learning. Let's see. This is another figure of the Johns Hopkins process. So it gives you step-by-step within each of the different categories in that green section on the last model. And this is in your textbook, figure 1410. So you can look at it a little more closely too. Another really good and easy to use model. And finally, the 7-star model of knowledge transformation. This model was developed by Kathleen Stevens in 2004 and then revised in 2015. And it grew out of work from the Academic Center for Evidence-Based Practice at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. It addresses, which makes sense, right? It's a star, so it's from Texas. It addresses how to overcome the challenges of knowledge transformation into practice. I really like this model, but I almost think it's too simple for people who are just learning how to do evidence-based practice. It is the steps of evidence-based practice. So to me, it doesn't give a person any more knowledge than just understanding what evidence-based practice is. Essentially, this is saying that knowledge transformation is the conversion of research findings from primary research results through a series of stages and forms to make an impact on health outcomes by way of evidence-based action. So this one says discovery research. So asking a question, evidence summary, a synthesis of knowledge compiled into one statement, so a PICO question, translation to guidelines, practice integration, and then the process, outcome, and evaluation. And it talks about the inclusive view of evidence-based practice on health outcomes, satisfaction, efficacy, and efficiency of care and health policy. So all models are good. Definitely, they've all been used in practice and have had successes. So any model one would use would be effective for a project, but our goal was really to keep it simple for you guys.